Welcome to Beat Diabetes. I'm Dennis Pollock, and I have some sad news for you who are our diabetes beaters. Our beloved Dr. Richard Bernstein has passed away. I learned about this from a comment under one of my videos, the last video I posted, and checked it out, looked it up on the internet, and sure enough, he has passed away at the age of 90. He was just about 2 months away from his 91st birthday. So not quite to 91, but close. And we're all mourning him and sad for his passing, but so thankful for his life. Who was Dr. Bernstein, you might ask? Well, he was kind of the grandfather of the low-carb movement as a means of beating diabetes. Long before Dennis Pollock ever came along, long before Jason Fung ever thought about low-carb, there was Dr. Richard Bernstein, practically a voice in the wilderness all by himself saying low carb is the way to go. Was he keto? Did he preach a keto diet? Well, not exactly. He preached a low carb diet, but he didn't seem to mind whether you emphasized protein or fat more. He seemed to focus maybe a little more on protein, but mainly just stay away from the carbs. Keep the carbs low. So before we go any further, let me play a part of a clip that I did about 5 years ago as I was talking about how Dr. Bernstein came to be the man that he eventually became, the one who was, in my mind, the foremost doctor and voice for the low-carb movement in terms of beating diabetes. Some of you who've been helped by me to get your blood glucose down may have assumed that I'm just a new guy who's appeared with my own new ideas about diabetes and blood sugar. But the truth is, I'm simply following in the footsteps of a number of brilliant doctors and researchers who knew these things long before I ever did. But who was the first? I'm not sure that anybody would ever be able to answer that question. We could talk about Robert Atkins, or we could go back all the way to the early 20th century and discuss some of the doctors who were encouraging the reduction or elimination of starches and sweets. Or we could go all the way back into the 1800s and look at William Banting, who wrote a pamphlet that became hugely popular, where he recommended a diet minus starches and sweets for weight loss. But many of these guys were far more concerned with weight loss than they were with diabetes. In this video, I want to talk about a man who essentially pioneered the low-carb approach specifically for diabetes. And the reason he was so focused on diabetes was that he was a diabetic himself. In fact, a type 1 diabetic. I'm talking about Dr. Richard Bernstein, to whom the diabetic world owes an enormous debt. Today, I want to look at where he got his ideas and the roots and the foundation of his low-carb approach to diabetes, which has become a worldwide phenomenon today. Richard Bernstein became a type 1 diabetic in 1946, a long time ago, at the age of 12. In those days, type 1 diabetes was a terrible affliction that would almost certainly shorten one's life by several decades at a minimum. The fact that he is still alive today and practicing medicine at the age of 85 is a pretty powerful testimony to the effectiveness of his methods of diabetic control. After his diagnosis of type 1 diabetes, Richard spent the next 22 years doing what the doctors instructed him, and having blood sugars soaring sky high and then dropping so low he could barely function. His doctors put him on a high-carb, low-fat diet which virtually guaranteed monstrous fluctuations in his blood sugar. He took insulin, of course, as a type 1, but it could not possibly keep up with all the carbs that he was eating. Plus, there was no way he could precisely match his insulin dosage with the high-carb meals that he was eating. His blood sugar highs and lows took a terrible toll on him. He developed serious kidney disease, frozen shoulders, and infections of all kinds. He was constantly taking antibiotics to deal with the infections. He had night blindness so bad that when he entered a movie theater, he'd have to sit in the nearest chair for up to half an hour just waiting for his vision to adjust to the darkness, after which he could finally walk down to the middle section and actually see the seats. Bernstein's growth was stunted, and he never achieved either the height or weight of the boys and later the men who were his age. Try as he might, he could never get any heavier than 115 pounds. His life changed, and indeed the life of many diabetics who've been helped by him since then, including myself when he saw an advertisement for a blood sugar meter in the back of a medical magazine. Now, Bernstein wasn't a doctor yet at this time, but he had subscribed to this magazine when he had worked as a medical supplier of hospitals. Until then, the only way to know your blood glucose levels was to go to the doctor and have him take your blood and send it off to a laboratory. But in this magazine, there was an ad for a machine which could test your blood on the spot and within 1 minute tell you what your glucose levels were. Richard was fascinated, and he wondered if this machine could help him with some of his diabetic woes. The problem was that it wasn't available to the general public, and it was sold only to doctors and hospitals. However, Richard was married at this point, and his wife just happened to be a doctor. Using her stationery with her permission, he ordered the 3-pound blood sugar testing machine for the price of $650, which is over $4,000 in today's money. When it arrived, he immediately put it to use, testing himself over and over again. He wanted to know what raises blood sugar, how does insulin lower blood sugar, and by how much. His most urgent concern was to see if this device, this ancient ancestor of our modern little Mike the blood sugar meter, could help him stop these terrible diabetic complications. For 3 years, he tested and tested and tested himself and seemed to make almost no improvement. His physical problems showed no signs of letting up, he gained no weight, and there was no indication that for all his testing he was really doing himself any good. But at this point, he had not yet seen the need to truly normalize his blood sugar. He had been assuming that he could fix most of his diabetic problems through exercise, and he had lifted weights like crazy. But it made no difference in anything. But everything changed when, as he researched diabetes, he saw an article which suggested that tests in animals revealed that diabetic complications had been prevented and sometimes reversed, not through exercise, but through bringing their blood sugars into the normal range. This possibility was thrilling to young Bernstein. If it worked in animals, could it not work in humans? He talked to his doctors, who threw cold water on his query and told him that humans were not animals, and furthermore it was, in their minds, impossible to get a diabetic's blood sugar, and especially a type 1 diabetic, into the normal range. But Richard Bernstein had a bit of the rebel in him, as most folks do who beat diabetes. He wanted to find out for himself whether this could personally work in his own life. He wrote, "Since I had been trained as an engineer, not as a physician, I knew nothing of such impossibilities. And since I was desperate, I had no choice but to pretend I was an animal." Over the next year, he tested himself more and made various adjustments to his diet. He says, if a change brought an improvement, I'd retain it. If it made the blood sugar worse, I'd discard it. I discovered that 1 gram of carbohydrate raised my blood sugar by 5 milligrams per deciliter, and 1/2 unit of the old beef-pork insulin lowered it by 15 milligrams per deciliter. Within 1 year, he had his answer. By constant testing and making changes in his diet based on his tests, within a year he had his blood glucose down into the normal range. No more crazy highs, no more scary lows, just beautiful, normal, stable blood sugar. He had cut his necessary insulin by 2/3, and many of his diabetic complications reversed themselves, and those that remained did not get worse. Bernstein wrote, "I had the new sensation of being the boss of my own metabolic state, and began to feel the same sense of accomplishment and reward I had in engineering when I solved a difficult problem. I had taught myself how to make my blood sugar levels whatever I wanted them to be. and was no longer on the roller coaster. Things were under my control. Bernstein had found an answer to his own diabetic woes using an ancient ancestor of Mike the Meter. And as he read diabetic magazines, he found it very strange that the virtually unanimous opinion of the doctors of his day was that, number one, it's impossible for diabetics to achieve normal blood sugar, and two, even if it were possible, it was definitely not desirable, and any attempt to do that would cause more harm than good. Bernstein writes, "How was it that I, an engineer, had figured out how to do what was impossible for medical professionals?" I hope you found that inspiring. It's inspiring to me just to hear my own words about Dr. Bernstein, but primarily because of his powerful testimony. Right now, I'm going to share a few testimonies from people that have written in and posted things about their feelings about the great Dr. Richard K. Bernstein. Here's someone who says, "I'm speechless. This man has literally and single-handedly spared me from a life of pain, suffering, and horrible complications. It was back in 2002. I had zero control over my blood sugar. I never checked my blood sugar. I took just enough insulin to survive. My sister intervened and decided to take me to a bookstore to find a book to help me learn how to manage my blood sugar. She randomly found his book and bought it for me. That one act saved my life, I'm quite sure. I realized something no other doctor had ever told me. One, that I could have normal blood sugar as a type 1 and get off the madness roller coaster. And two, that many complications were reversible." And this individual goes on to say, "Bernstein has been one of the true North Stars of my life. He was courageous enough to not only figure out how to manage diabetes better than 99% of doctors, but to put out that information for the rest of us, despite hostility from the medical community." And boy, you can say that again. The medical community, you would have thought, would be, opening their arms saying, "Wow, thank you, Dr. Bernstein, for enlightening us." And instead, he got so much hostility, criticism, ridicule, and persecution. He thought, well, if I become a doctor, I can have a better voice. And that was true. But if he thought that he was going to quiet his critics by becoming a doctor, that was not true. They still were his critics. Here's another individual who wrote in memorial to Dr. Bernstein, "Dr. Bernstein has saved my daughter's life. We are thankful that he shared his knowledge, wisdom, and experience so generously. He gives me hope that my 12-year-old daughter with diabetes type 1 can also turn 90 one day and lead a full life. Thank you." Wow, isn't that great? There's a word for that, what this person is describing, and the word is hope. Hope that you are not doomed. Hope that you or your child with diabetes, type 1 or type 2, can live out their life fully, reverse so many of their symptoms, and be fully engaged in this thing we call life. Now, I could read testimonies like these regarding Dr. Bernstein for 24 hours and still not be anywhere close to done. He has helped so many thousands, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people with diabetes. And of course, he has an indirect blessing through me, because anybody that I've been able to help, to him goes a great deal of the credit, because I learned a lot from him. Let me just talk about my own experience. When I first started out coming down with runaway blood sugar and diabetes was coming at me like a freight train, I got hold of some information that said that the whole foods, plant-based way was the way to go. That's how you beat diabetes. You just cut out the meat from your diet and essentially everything will be fine. And I had no biases in those days. I wasn't particularly biased one way or the other. I just wanted relief because it was uncomfortable having high blood sugar, and it was terrible having low blood sugar, that is. It was terrible having low blood sugar. And so I laid hold of that idea of cutting out all the meat, became a vegetarian, and things got worse for me. My blood sugar was all over the map. It had been before, but it was worse now. It got to the point where I couldn't go more than 2 or 3 hours without eating. I would carry snacks with me, and every 2 or 3 hours after a meal, I would eat a snack just to keep from having low blood sugar. But it was also going way too high, and it was just a mess. So I was following some things that I read that said, that's the way you go. You cut out all the meat and everything will be fine. Basically, carbs don't matter one way or the other. You just cut out the meat and you'll be good. And then I read a book from written by a lady who had been a patient personally of Dr. Bernstein. And she told his low-carb approach. And his approach was you eat very low carb. And if you're a type 1, you take just the proper amount of insulin to cover that low-carb diet, which isn't going to be too much, relatively. If you're a type 2, you still do the low-carb. You just probably won't need insulin. So anyway, she wrote her story. And that was eye-opening to me because it was the first time it dawned on me that maybe instead of going no meat, I should do low-carb. I wasn't sure yet. And then I got hold of Dr. Bernstein's book, Diabetes Solution, and I became more of a believer. I read Dr. Robert Atkins' book, and that also helped. And then I started testing my glucose with these post-meal tests, and they confirmed everything that, they confirmed everything Dr. Bernstein and Dr. Atkins were saying, that low carb quells your raging glucose levels, and it stops those glucose spikes, and you end up with very gentle rising of your glucose after meals, not huge spikes. And what that means is if your glucose doesn't go up too high, chances are it's not going to come down too low. And that was certainly the case for me. Now, I didn't take insulin. I was taking no diabetic meds at all. But just by an overreactive pancreas, and the technical word for this or term is reactive hypoglycemia. You're overreacting to any kind of high-carb meals. So you're going up too high, you're bouncing down too low. And as soon as I employed the low-carb diet, such as Dr. Bernstein recommends, although I didn't get quite as strict with myself in those early days as he was preaching, he's always maintained that you should have about 30 grams of carbs per day, 6 for your breakfast, 12 for your lunch, 12 for your dinner. Boom, that's it, 30 grams of carbs per day. In my case, I didn't cut it down that fast at that time. I probably am getting pretty close to that, or maybe even below that sometimes these days. But anyway, it made a huge difference in my life, and I became one of his big fanboys. And you know that if you've watched my channel very long. I probably reviewed his books more than anybody else. I've used his name more than anybody else. I've shared his story more than once. So I am a big fan. And like I said, indirectly, he's blessing people through this channel and through the little bit that I can add from my own experience and my own little abilities. I wanted to share something that impressed me so much. I wish I had his exact description. I read it or I heard him say it years ago. I've never forgotten the sum of it, but I've forgotten maybe some of the details. But basically it's this. Dr. Bernstein was at a medical convention, and somebody was giving a talk about diabetes, and it was primarily for doctors, and I guess also maybe medical personnel and health workers. So this particular medical doctor that was speaking was declaring that it is unreasonable to expect any person who's ever become diabetic to ever have normal blood sugar again. He said it can't be done. It shouldn't be emphasized. You shouldn't even try it with them. Basically, it's the old worn-out idea that if they can just stay somewhere in the 7s with their A1C, which is not normal, it's high. But the idea is if we can just keep them in the 7s, they probably won't have too many hypos, and that's about the best we can expect. But he emphasized you cannot expect someone who's once passed the boundary line of diabetes to ever have normal glucose again. And after he made that statement, and kind of went into it a little bit. He said, now we all agree with that, right? And almost everybody kind of smiled and nodded their head. I don't think Dr. Bernstein did. And then he made his mistake, this medical doctor. He said, is there anyone here that doesn't agree with that? That is, you don't agree with my idea that we should never expect a diabetic to have normal glucose again. And Dr. Bernstein snuck up his hand and boldly declared, he was the only one out of that big group that was listening to this medical doctor. He was a doctor himself by that time, I'm pretty sure, but he was the only one that dared disagree. And the doctor said, you don't agree that we cannot expect diabetics to have normal glucose? And Dr. Bernstein said, no, I don't agree. He said, I am a type 1 diabetic and I have normal glucose. And just blew that man out of the water. I don't remember what all went on after that. I don't think he told too much, but must have been the most shocking aspect of that whole medical convention. I'm sure everybody went home shaking their head thinking, what kind of a nut is this guy? But that's what he emphasized. He emphasized that diabetics can have normal glucose. And he didn't just say it as a theory, he lived it. He kept his glucose in the 80s and his A1C in the mid-4s all of his life, as far as I know. And up until January of this year, 2025, he was still practicing, he was still healthy at the age of 90, and he was still taking on new patients. He had a full-time medical practice. There was somebody on the Facebook page that was acting for him and said, people are always asking me, is he still alive? He said, yeah, he's not only alive, he's thriving, he's healthy, he's taken on new patients. Now, I don't know how it was he passed away. Once you get to 90, probably the standard answer of how someone dies is natural causes. So maybe that was it, or maybe we'll find something out. I tried to look and see if there was a cause of death associated with his passing, and I couldn't find it, but that may turn up. But as far as we know, it was natural causes. But one way or the other, 90 and still practicing up until apparently the last, month or two. That ain't too shabby. So way to go, Dr. Bernstein. You have been such a blessing to so many of us, and I will declare you've been an inspiration to me. Now, when Bernstein began to preach low carb, very few people were saying that. Today, lots of doctors, lots of nutritionists, and even lowly non-doctors, non-nutritionists like yours truly are preaching the low-carbohydrate diet. Who will take Dr. Bernstein's place as his heir and the foremost spokesman for this lifestyle and this diet? Well, my vote would go for Dr. Jason Fung. He is very eloquent, very good, very knowledgeable. And again, there's very little daylight between him and me in terms of what we both believe. So naturally, I would like him. But he's not the only one. I mean, there are dozens and scores and hundreds and just all kinds of people, doctors, medical personnel, and lots of people that are not doctors that are all saying low carb is the way to go. So I salute Dr. Bernstein for a life well lived. He blessed so many, many people, and we are thankful for him. If you've recently been diagnosed with diabetes and you've just discovered this channel, let me recommend that you go to our uploads page, which will give you access to every diabetic video we've posted since we began. As you work your way through all our videos, I believe you'll find the help you need. A link to our uploads page is in the description.